My story began with an ordinary family vacation. My wife, 2 children, and I decided to spend a week in an old country house that I had inherited from my grandfather. The house stood in the woods, far away from civilization. I have always loved this place, its quietness and solitude. We arrived in the late afternoon. The house was locked, just as I had left it years ago. Opening the door, we entered the cool hallway. The smell of old wooden walls and dusty air immediately reminded me of my childhood. We quickly unpacked and went to bed, tired from the long drive. The next day we began to look around the house and grounds. The kids were running around the yard, playing hide and seek among the trees. My wife cooked in the kitchen, and I went to the basement to check on the old generator. When I came down, a wave of memories swept over me. As a kid, I used to hide here often when I played hide and seek with my sister. The generator was working properly, so I went back upstairs. In the evening, we sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth of the fire. Everything was peaceful, even too peaceful. Suddenly, I heard someone knocking on the door. We weren't expecting guests. I went to open it, but there was no one at the door. I thought it was the children playing and went back to the fireplace. The next day, the children found an old well in the woods. I remembered Grandpa telling me that this well had been abandoned and unsafe for a long time. I strictly forbade the children to go near it, but I felt uneasy. At night, I couldn't sleep, listening to every sound. The house seemed too quiet, too empty. On the third day, I noticed that my wife was troubled. She said she saw a strange figure in the woods. We decided it was just shadow play and fatigue. But in the evening, I heard another knock at the door. This time it was louder. I opened the door sharply, but again there was no one there. Fear began to creep up to my heart. The next few days passed in suspense. We all began to notice strange things. Doors and windows would open on their own. Things would disappear and reappear in unexpected places. One night, I woke up to someone whispering softly in my ear. There was no one in the room. One morning, I found fresh mud marks on the windowsill. I went into the woods to see if the kids had gotten in there. When I got to the well, I saw that the lid had been pushed to the side. I looked inside and felt the cold rising from the depths, but the well was empty. On the 5th day, my wife disappeared. My children and I searched for her all over the house and grounds, shouting her name, but to no avail. In a panic, I decided I had to go back to town for help. But when we got to the car, we found that all the tires were flat. We were cut off from the outside world. During the night, I heard footsteps in the attic. I took a flashlight and slowly climbed up the ladder. The attic was empty, but I noticed that one of the old paintings had been torn off the wall. Behind it was a small doorway. I didn't know it existed. I went through it and found myself in a narrow corridor leading deeper into the house. I walked down the hallway and found a small room filled with old things and pictures. Among them were pictures of my family taken in the last days. In the corner was an old book of notes. I started reading and realized it was my grandfather's diary. Grandpa wrote in his diary about strange events that happened in the house many years ago. He mentioned mysterious disappearances and strange noises at night. The diary ended with a mention of some evil that lived in the woods and visited the house through an old well. I realized that my family and I were facing the same fate as my grandfather. I returned to my room and found the children huddled together in fear. We decided that we should spend the night together, locking all the doors and windows. The night was agonizing. There were strange rustles and quiet footsteps in the house. I kept my eyes open, listening to every sound. Suddenly, there was a knock at the window. I jumped up and saw a silhouette behind the glass. He stood motionless, staring straight at me. I was paralyzed with terror. At dawn, I ventured out of the house and back to the well. I took with me an old rope and a flashlight. The children remained in the house, locked in one of the rooms. I walked over to the well and looked inside again. This time, I noticed something shiny at the bottom. I climbed down into the well, holding on to the rope. At the bottom, I found an old locket that belonged to my grandmother. I picked it up and felt something cold touch my hand. Suddenly, the rope loosened, and I began to fall. When I found myself at the bottom of the well, I saw a narrow passage leading into the darkness. I didn't know what awaited me, but I decided to keep going. After going through the passage, I found myself in an underground cave. In the light of my flashlight, I saw footsteps leading down into the depths. Footsteps echoed in the silence. Suddenly, I heard screams. It was my wife. I ran toward the sound and soon found her. She was bound and lying on the cold ground. I freed her, and we embraced. She told me that some people had kidnapped her, and that they were trying to force her to talk about the family's secrets. We decided to go back to the children and get out of this nightmare together. When we got back to the well, we were in for an unpleasant surprise. The entrance was blocked with rocks. We were locked inside. I tried to find another way out, but it was all in vain. We were trapped. Then I remembered my grandfather's diary. He mentioned a secret exit from the cave that led to an old cemetery behind the forest. We started looking for that exit. Soon we found a small tunnel leading upward. After going through it, we found ourselves in the cemetery. Once on the surface, we were relieved, but the joy was short-lived. In the distance, I saw several silhouettes approaching us. They were the very people my wife had spoken of. We ran, holding the children's hands. We ran through the woods and back to the house. But as we approached, we saw that the door was open. It was dark and quiet inside. I gathered all my courage and went in. Suddenly, something grabbed my shoulder, and I felt a sharp pain. It was one of those men. He was holding a knife and was trying to attack me. We started struggling, and at one point, I was able to knock the knife out of his hand. We fell to the floor, and I heard my wife screaming, urging the children to run. At that moment, I found the strength to get up and throw my attacker off. We jumped out of the house and ran down the road leading to the town. Soon we met an old acquaintance who was passing by. He picked us up in his car and drove us into town. We were safe, but the fear and horror of what had happened stayed with us forever. I gave the documents I had found and my grandfather's diary to journalists, and the story of the terrible events in the old house was publicized. But I knew that my family and I had a long way to go to recover from the nightmare. That house and the forest will remain in my memory as a symbol of unknown secrets and threats hidden in silence and shadow.